Here's part one of the story in approximately 770 words, using simple English in third-person style. Harold Thompson lived in his small but tidy apartment on Sater Street for over 4 decades. Every morning, like clockwork, he would wake up at exactly 6:15 a.m., a habit he never broke since his Navy days. At 93, his movements were slower than they used to be, but his mind remained sharp as a tack. His modest living room walls told stories through faded photographs, young Harold in his crisp Navy uniform, yellowed newspaper clippings, and a few medals carefully preserved behind glass. Each morning, he would straighten these frames as part of his routine, though they rarely needed adjusting. On this particular autumn morning, Harold took extra care while combing his thin white hair and putting on his favorite checkered shirt. His weathered hand smoothed down the collar 3 times before he was satisfied. The morning light caught the silver wedding band he still wore, 15 years after his beloved Martha had passed away. Another day, another adventure, he whispered to her photo on his bedside table. At 6:45 a.m., Harold began his careful journey down the 3 flights of stairs. The elevator had been broken for 2 weeks, but he never complained. The morning exercise, he believed, kept his legs strong. Mrs. Rodriguez from apartment 2B always waited to check on him as he passed her floor. She had offered to help him numerous times, but Harold politely declined each time with a gentle smile. The crisp morning air greeted him as he stepped outside. Harold adjusted his Navy veteran cap, the one his granddaughter Jenny had given him last Christmas. The 3-block walk to Pete's Diner was his favorite part of the day. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every flowering bush, and every friendly neighborhood cat that crossed his path. Pete's Diner had been serving breakfast since 1962, and Harold had been a regular customer for most of those years. The bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open at precisely 7 a.m. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around him like a warm blanket. "Morning, Harold." Sarah, the waitress who had been working there for the past 12 years, called out cheerfully. She already had his usual corner booth ready, the one with the best view of both the street and the kitchen. The vinyl seats were worn smooth from years of use, but to Harold, they were more comfortable than any fancy restaurant chair. "Good morning, Sarah," Harold replied with a warm smile. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" His voice was soft but clear, carrying the kind of gentle authority that came from decades of life experience. Sarah brought him his regular order without him having to ask. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a small bowl of oatmeal with raisins. Harold arranged his napkin on his lap with military precision, just as he had done every morning for the past 20 years. The diner slowly filled with its regular morning crowd. Harold knew most of them by name, or at least by sight. There was Tom, the mailman, grabbing his coffee before starting his route. Mary from the flower shop always sat at the counter, reading her romance novels while eating her bagel. The morning routine was as predictable as the sunrise, and Harold found great comfort in that predictability. As he ate his breakfast, Harold would solve the daily crossword puzzle from the local newspaper that Pete, the diner's owner, always saved for him. His hands might have been shaky, but his mind still worked through the clues with remarkable speed. Other regulars would occasionally stop by his booth to ask for help with a particularly tricky answer, and Harold was always happy to assist. On this morning, however, something felt different. The usual peaceful atmosphere was disrupted by the rumble of motorcycle engines outside. Harold looked up from his crossword puzzle to see several large motorcycles pulling into the parking lot. The machines gleamed in the morning sun, their chrome pipes reflecting the light like mirrors. The bell above the door chimed again, but this time it wasn't the gentle tinkle Harold was used to. It was more like a warning. 6 leather-clad bikers strutted in, their heavy boots thudding against the worn linoleum floor. The peaceful morning routine that Harold had grown to love was about to change dramatically, though he didn't know it yet. He simply turned back to his crossword puzzle, unaware that his quiet life was about to become the talk of the town, and his morning ritual would never be quite the same again. The bikers claimed Harold's corner booth the very next day, arriving just minutes before his usual time. Sarah watched helplessly through the serving window as Harold walked up to the diner, his navy cap catching the morning light. The bell chimed as he entered, and for the first time in 20 years, his corner booth wasn't waiting for him. The group of bikers sprawled across the booth, their leather jackets creaking as they laughed loudly at some private joke. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, noticed Harold first. He nudged his companions, and their laughter died down to amused snickers. "Well, look what we got here, boys," the leader said, his voice carrying across the quiet diner. "Seems like we took Grandpa's special seat." The other bikers chuckled, their eyes following Harold as he quietly made his way to the counter. Sarah hurried over to Harold, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Harold. I tried to save your booth, but she trailed off, glancing nervously at the bikers. "It's all right, Sarah," Harold said softly, settling onto a counter stool. "A seat's a seat." But they both knew it wasn't true. The counter didn't have the same view of the street that Harold loved, nor could he spread out his crossword puzzle like he usually did. The bikers made it their mission to arrive early every morning after that. They seemed to take special pleasure in watching Harold walk in and realize his booth was taken. Their taunts grew bolder with each passing day. "Hey, old-timer, your walker's blocking the aisle," one would call out, even though Harold walked perfectly well on his own. "Better eat quick, Gramps, before you forget why you're here," another would joke, ignoring the fact that Harold's mind was still sharp as ever. The other regular customers noticed the change in atmosphere. Tom the mailman started taking his coffee to go. Mary from the flower shop stopped bringing her romance novels and ate quickly, keeping her head down. The peaceful morning routine that everyone had enjoyed was shattered. Pete, the diner's owner, tried to intervene once. "Now listen here," he had started, approaching the bikers' table, but one look at their threatening expressions made him back down. He had a business to run, after all, and the bikers were paying customers. Harold never complained. He ate his breakfast with the same dignity he always had, though Sarah noticed his hands shaking more than usual as he filled out his crossword puzzle at the cramped counter. The bikers' loud motorcycles would often rev their engines right outside the window, making Harold's coffee cup rattle on its saucer. One morning, about 3 weeks after the bikers first arrived, things took a turn for the worse. Harold was walking to his counter seat when one of the bikers deliberately stretched out his leg, causing the elderly veteran to stumble. Harold caught himself on the counter, but his navy cap fell to the floor. Before he could reach for it, the biker's boot came down on the cap, dragging it across the linoleum floor. The other bikers roared with laughter as their friend picked up the cap, twirling it on his finger. "Looking for this, old-timer?" he taunted, holding it just out of Harold's reach. The diner fell silent. Sarah stood frozen behind the counter, a coffee pot trembling in her hands. Pete stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, unsure what to do. Harold straightened up slowly, his blue eyes fixed on his cap. For a moment, something flickered across his face, not fear, but something else, something that made the smirk on the biker's face falter slightly. "Son," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the silent diner, "that cap was a gift from my granddaughter. I'd appreciate it back." The biker's grin widened. "Oh yeah? And what if I don't feel like giving it back? What's a old man like you gonna do about it?" It was at that moment, as Harold stood facing the group of bikers, that everyone in Pete's diner realized they were about to witness something extraordinary. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, as Harold Thompson prepared to show these young men exactly what a 93-year-old veteran was capable of doing. Harold stood perfectly still, his posture straight despite his age, as he faced the group of laughing bikers. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the diner's floor, and for a brief moment, it seemed to take the shape of a much younger man in military stance. "I said," Harold repeated calmly, "I'd like my cap back." His voice remained steady, though Sarah noticed his right hand gripping the counter edge slightly tighter than usual. The biker with Harold's cap pretended to examine it closely. "Navy, huh?" he sneered, reading the embroidery. "Bet you were just some cook on a boat, old man." His friends laughed, but their laughter held a nervous edge now. Something about Harold's calm demeanor was unsettling. Pete's diner had grown so quiet that the gentle ticking of the wall clock seemed to echo. The regular customers watched the scene unfold, their breakfasts forgotten. Mary from the flower shop had her hand over her mouth, while Tom the mailman stood halfway out of his seat, unsure whether to intervene. The biker gang's leader, who called himself Snake, studied Harold with narrowing eyes. Unlike his rowdy companions, he noticed things they missed. The way Harold's feet were planted firmly apart, his balanced stance, the look in his eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond their understanding. "Give it back, Jimmy," Snake suddenly ordered, surprising everyone. The biker holding the cap turned to his leader in confusion. "But boss, we're just having some fun." "I said give it back," Snake repeated, his voice carrying an edge of authority that made Jimmy quickly toss the cap onto the counter. It slid across the surface, coming to rest near Harold's coffee cup. Harold picked up his cap, carefully brushed it off, and placed it back on his head with deliberate precision. He didn't say a word of thanks. There was no need to thank someone for returning what was rightfully his. The incident seemed to be over, but it marked a turning point. The bikers' harassment became more subtle but more focused. They would arrive earlier each day, taking not just Harold's booth, but also making sure to occupy all the comfortable counter seats, leaving only the wobbly stool at the very end. They began timing their loudest conversations to coincide with Harold working on his crossword puzzle. They would bump his elbow while walking past, causing his coffee to spill or his pen to scratch across the newspaper. Small things, nothing that could be clearly called out as harassment, but enough to disturb the peace Harold had known for so many years. Sarah tried her best to help, bringing Harold extra napkins when his coffee spilled, or offering him free refills. Pete would turn up the diner's radio to drown out the bikers' noise, but it only made them talk louder. Through it all, Harold maintained his dignity. He continued to arrive at 7 a.m. sharp, ate his breakfast with the same methodical precision, and worked on his crossword puzzles despite the distractions. But those who knew him well could see the toll it was taking. His hands shook more when he lifted his coffee cup. Dark circles appeared under his eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. The warm smile he usually shared with other regulars became less frequent, though he never failed to thank Sarah for her service or greet Pete each morning. One morning, Harold overheard the bikers talking in low voices, thinking he couldn't hear them over the diner's background noise. But years of military training had kept his hearing sharp. "That old man needs to learn his place," one of them muttered. "Saw him looking at my bike funny yesterday." "Yeah," another agreed. "Maybe we should teach him a lesson about respecting other people's property." Snake, who had been unusually quiet lately, watched Harold with an odd expression. It was almost as if he was trying to remember something, some story he'd heard long ago about a Navy man who wasn't quite what he seemed. Harold finished his coffee, left his usual tip for Sarah, and walked out of the diner with measured steps. He knew tomorrow would bring another test of his patience, another day of enduring their presence. But as he walked home, his back straight despite the weight of years, he began to think that perhaps it was time to show these young men exactly who they were dealing with. The next day would change everything, though none of them knew it yet. The quiet veteran was about to remind the world why you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book had been written in the pages of military history. The morning started like any other, with Harold making his way to Pete's diner. But this day was different. The air felt heavier, charged with tension like the calm before a storm. As he approached the diner, he noticed all 6 motorcycles parked differently than usual, forming a tight semicircle around his usual walking path. Inside, the bikers were already there. They weren't in their usual booth. Instead, they had spread themselves across different tables, their leather jackets creaking as they turned to watch Harold enter. Their eyes followed his every move, reminding him of predators stalking their prey. Sarah's hands trembled as she poured Harold's coffee. She had overheard more of their plans the previous evening while cleaning tables. "Harold," she whispered, "maybe you should take breakfast at home today." Her eyes darted nervously toward the bikers. "Thank you for your concern, Sarah," Harold replied softly, stirring his coffee with steady hands. "But I've never run from trouble before. Not about to start now." The morning progressed with unusual quietness. Even the regular customers sensed something was wrong. Tom the mailman lingered longer than usual, pretending to read his paper while keeping an eye on the situation. Mary from the flower shop had called Pate, saying she wasn't feeling well, her first missed breakfast in 5 years. Around 8 a.m., Snake stood up and walked over to Harold. The old veteran continued solving his crossword puzzle, seemingly oblivious to the biker's approach. Snake placed both hands on the counter, leaning down close to Harold's ear. "You scratched my bike yesterday, old man," Snake said, his voice low but clear enough for nearby customers to hear. "That's going to cost you." Harold looked up from his puzzle, meeting Snake's eyes in the counter's mirror. "I didn't scratch your motorcycle, son. I may be old, but my eyes work just fine, and I keep my distance from things that aren't mine." Snake's face reddened. "Are you calling me a liar?" He straightened up, gesturing to his friends. "Boys, I think it's time we had a proper chat with our elderly friend. Outside." The other bikers rose from their seats, creating a wall of leather and denim behind their leader. The message was clear. This wasn't a request. Harold carefully folded his newspaper and placed it beside his half-finished coffee. He reached for his wallet, but Sarah quickly shook her head, tears in her eyes. Pete had emerged from the kitchen, holding a phone, his finger hovering over the keypad. "Don't call anyone, Pete," Harold said calmly, standing up from his stool. "Everything's going to be just fine." As Harold walked toward the door, surrounded by the bikers, something strange happened. His stooped shoulders straightened ever so slightly. His shuffling gait became more measured, more purposeful. Even the way he held his head seemed different, less like a man in his 90s and more like someone who had commanded respect. The group moved into the parking lot, where the morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement. The bikers formed a loose circle around Harold, with Snake standing directly in front of him. "Time to teach you about respect," Snake growled, cracking his knuckles. Harold looked at each of the young men in turn, his blue eyes sharp and clear. When he spoke, his voice carried across the parking lot with surprising strength. "Before we proceed with whatever you have planned," he said, "there's something you should know about me." He paused, removing his navy cap and holding it carefully in his hands. "Something about who I really am and what I did before you were born." The bikers exchanged glances, some of them shifting uncomfortably. There was something in Harold's voice that made them hesitate. A quiet authority that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there but hidden beneath his gentle exterior. Inside the diner, customers pressed against the windows, watching the scene unfold. Sarah clutched her coffee pot like a lifeline, while Pete stood with the phone still in his hand, transfixed by what was happening outside. No one knew it yet, but the next words out of Harold Thompson's mouth would change everything, not just for him and the bikers, but for everyone who witnessed what was about to happen in that parking lot on an ordinary morning that had become anything but ordinary. Harold stood in the center of the parking lot, surrounded by the 6 bikers who had made the past few weeks of his life miserable. The morning sun caught the medals pinned to his cap, making them glint like small flames in his hands. In 1952, Harold began, his voice carrying across the parking lot with unexpected strength. "I was selected for a special program. The Navy was looking for men who could handle more than just regular military duties." He paused, watching recognition slowly dawn on Snake's face. "They called us frogmen back then," Harold continued. "But today, you know them as Navy SEALs. I was part of the first teams, one of the originals who helped create what would become the most elite special operations force in the world." The smirks on the bikers' faces began to fade. Snake took a small step backward, his eyes fixed on Harold's face. The biker leader's complexion had gone slightly pale, as if seeing a ghost. "Wait," Snake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Harold Thompson, UDT Team 5? His tough exterior cracked completely as understanding washed over his face. Harold nodded slowly. "That's right, stun. Underwater Demolition Team 5, before we became SEALs. But how would you know that?" Snake's hands began to tremble. He reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a worn photograph. "My grandfather," he said, holding it out. "He told me stories about his training instructor, the toughest, most respected man he ever knew, a man named Harold Thompson." The other bikers gathered around, looking at the old black and white photograph. It showed a young Harold, standing tall and proud in his Navy uniform, next to a group of fresh-faced recruits. Among them was Snake's grandfather, wearing the same determined expression that Snake himself often wore. "Master Chief Thompson," Snake said, his voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather said you were the one who taught him everything he knew about being a warrior and a man. He said you saved his life twice during training, and countless times after that by teaching him the right way to do things." The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, looking between their leader and the elderly veteran they had been tormenting. Jimmy, who had played with Harold's cap weeks earlier, took off his own hat in respect. "Your grandfather was James Lightning Martinez," Harold said, studying Snake's face. "You have his eyes. He was one of the best men I ever trained, brave, loyal, and smart. He never backed down from a challenge, but he also never forgot the difference between being tough and being cruel." Snake's tough guy facade crumbled completely. "My real name is James too," he said quietly. Named after him. He passed away last year, but he never stopped talking about you, about what you taught him. The parking lot fell silent. Through the diner's windows, the regular customers and staff watched in amazement as the scene unfolded. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, while Pete stood with his mouth open in surprise. I thought the stories were just that, stories, Snake continued, looking ashamed. A legend about the early days of the seals. I never imagined, never thought. He couldn't finish his sentence. Harold placed a gentle hand on Snake's shoulder. Your grandfather would be disappointed to see how you've been acting, he said softly. He knew that true strength isn't about intimidation. It's about protecting those who need protection, standing up for what's right, and treating everyone, with respect. Snake nodded, tears forming in his eyes. The other bikers looked at the ground, shuffling their feet, the weight of their actions over the past weeks getting them all at once. I'm so sorry, Master Chief, Snake said, using Harold's old title. We all are. We've dishonored everything my grandfather stood for, everything you taught him. Harold looked at the group of young men, seeing not the troublemakers they'd been, but the potential of who they could become. In their faces, he saw echoes of all the young men he'd trained over the years. Men who had learned to channel their strength into something noble and worthwhile. Well, Harold said, a slight smile crossing his face, it's never too late to learn. Your grandfather used to say that, remember? None of them knew it yet, but this moment in the parking lot was about to mark the beginning of something remarkable. A transformation that would affect not just these 6 bikers, but the entire community around Pete's Diner. Inside Pete's Diner, the morning regulars watched in amazement as the scene in the parking lot transformed from potential violence into something entirely different. Snake, the once intimidating leader of the bikers, wiped his eyes with the back of his leather-clad arm as he stared at his grandfather's old photograph. Would you? Snake hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. Would you join us for breakfast, Master Chief? I'd love to hear more about my grandfather during his training days. Harold smiled warmly, placing his navy cap back on his head. Only if we can all sit at my usual booth. The view of the street from there helps me tell my stories better. The group made their way back into the diner, but everything was different now. The bikers held the door open for Harold, treating him with the kind of respect usually reserved for royalty. The other customers watched in disbelief as the same men who had been tormenting the elderly veteran now pulled out a chair for him and waited for him to sit first. Sarah approached nervously with her coffee pot, but her anxiety melted away when she saw Harold's reassuring smile. Snake quickly stood up and took the pot from her hands. Let me help you with that, ma'am, he said softly. It's the least I can do after all the trouble we've caused. He carefully filled everyone's cups, starting with Harold's. As they settled in, Harold began sharing stories about the early days of the Navy SEALs. He told them about Snake's grandfather, James Lightning Martinez, and how he earned his nickname during an underwater training exercise. Your grandfather could move through water faster than anyone I'd ever seen, Harold explained, his eyes twinkling with the memory. During Hell Week, when most men could barely keep their heads up, he was still gliding through the ocean like he was born in it. The other bikers listened intently, their earlier roughness replaced by genuine respect and curiosity. Jimmy, who had once mocked Harold's age, now sat forward eagerly, asking questions about the training techniques and challenges the early SEALs faced. Pete came out from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of coffee and his special homemade cinnamon rolls, a treat he usually saved for Sundays. On the house today, he said, placing them on the table. It's not every day we get to hear stories from one of the original frogmen. As the morning wore on, other customers began joining their table, pulling up chairs to hear Harold's tales. Tom the mailman delayed his route, and even Mary from the flower shop came rushing in when she heard what was happening. Snake shared stories about his grandfather too, stories that matched perfectly with Harold's memories, filling in pieces of a puzzle that connected these 2 generations of warriors. The young biker's tough exterior had completely melted away, replaced by the proud grandson of a man who had helped shape military history. My grandfather kept a journal, Snake revealed, his voice thick with emotion. He wrote about the lessons you taught him, Master Chief. Not just about fighting and survival, but about honor, respect, and doing what's right. Harold nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. Your grandfather understood something very important. That true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about lifting them up, protecting those who need protection and standing firm against bullies and cowards. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the meaning clear in Harold's words. But there was no judgment in his tone, only wisdom and understanding. "We've been those bullies," Snake admitted, looking around at his friends. "But that changes today, right, boys?" The other bikers nodded firmly, their faces showing genuine remorse and determination to change. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting warm light through the diner's windows, something remarkable was happening. The divide between the young bikers and the elderly veteran had completely disappeared. In its place was a bridge of understanding, respect, and shared history. Pete's Diner, which had recently been a place of tension and discomfort, was once again filled with warmth and friendship. But now it was something more. It had become a place where the past and present came together, where lessons learned in the heat of military training found new life in the hearts of a younger generation. And Harold Thompson, sitting in his favorite booth surrounded by attentive listeners, knew that sometimes the greatest victories come not from confrontation, but from understanding and forgiveness. Over the next few weeks, Pete's Diner underwent a remarkable change. The bikers still arrived early each morning, but now they waited outside until Harold walked up, then escorted him to his booth like honored guardians. Their motorcycles, once parked haphazardly to intimidate, were now neatly lined up in a way that left clear paths for all customers. Snake had taken it upon himself to become Harold's unofficial protector. Every morning, you would pick Harold up from his apartment, carrying the veteran's newspaper and helping him down the stairs that still hadn't been repaired. The other bikers would take turns bringing Harold his mail or helping with small repairs around his apartment. "You know," Harold said one morning, watching the bikers help Sarah clean the diner's windows, "your grandfather would be proud of the man you're becoming, James." He always called Snake by his real name now, and the young man stood a little taller every time he heard it. The transformation wasn't limited to just the diner. The bikers began extending their protective nature to the entire neighborhood. They helped Mary from the flower shop unload her heavy deliveries and escorted elderly customers to their cars. Jimmy, once the most aggressive of the group, now spent his free time fixing the neighborhood kids' bicycles. Word spread through the community about the unlikely friendship between the elderly Navy SEAL and the reformed bikers. Local veterans began stopping by the diner, drawn by the chance to meet one of the original frogmen. The bikers listened to their stories with the same respect they showed Harold, learning about sacrifice, duty, and honor from men who had lived it. One morning, Snake arrived at the diner with a special surprise. He had gone through his grandfather's old footlocker and found something remarkable. "Master Chief," he said, placing a carefully wrapped package on the table, "I think you should have this." Harold unwrapped the package slowly, revealing a faded blue notebook. Opening it, he recognized the handwriting immediately. "James Lightning, Martinez's training journal. My grandfather wrote about everything you taught him," Snake explained, his voice soft with emotion. "Every lesson, every piece of advice. He made us read from it when we were kids, but I never really understood the importance until now." The diner fell quiet as Harold turned the pages, memories flooding back with each entry. There were detailed notes about underwater navigation, hand-to-hand combat techniques, and survival skills. But more importantly, there were passages about character, integrity, and the true meaning of strength. September 15, 1952, Harold read aloud. "Master Chief Thompson said something today that I'll never forget. The strongest man in the room isn't the one who can fight the best, but the one who can prevent the fight from happening in the first place." Snake's eyes welled up with tears. "That's why you didn't fight us that day in the parking lot, isn't it? You could have taken us all down, but you chose a better way." Harold nodded, closing the journal carefully. "Fighting is easy. Making peace is harder. Your grandfather understood that better than most." The other bikers, who had gathered around to listen, looked at their leader with new understanding. They had all witnessed Snake's transformation from an angry young man into someone who commanded respect through kindness rather than fear. Sarah, watching from behind the counter, couldn't help but marvel at the change. The diner was busier than ever now, filled with a mix of veterans, bikers, and regular customers all sharing stories and friendship. The once dreaded sound of motorcycles arriving now brought smiles to people's faces. Pete had even created a new breakfast special called the Frogman, inspired by Harold's favorite morning meal. The walls of the diner now featured photos of local veterans, including a prominent one of young Harold with Snake's grandfather. As Harold sat in his booth that morning, surrounded by his unlikely new family, he thought about how life had a way of coming full circle. Decades ago, he had trained young men to be warriors, teaching them about strength and courage. Now, in his twilight years, he was still teaching those same lessons, just in a different way. The transformation of the bikers wasn't just about them changing their ways. It was about understanding that true strength comes in many forms, and that it's never too late to choose a better path. Through Harold's quiet wisdom and patient guidance, they were learning what Snake's grandfather had learned all those years ago, that the greatest battles are often won with kindness rather than force. 1 year had passed since the memorable confrontation in Pete's Diner's parking lot. The small restaurant had become more than just a local breakfast spot. It had transformed into a gathering place where veterans and community members came together, all thanks to the unlikely friendship between a 93-year-old former Navy SEAL and a group of reformed bikers. On this particular morning, Harold arrived to find the diner decorated with balloons and a large banner reading "Happy 94th Birthday, Master Chief." Snake and his crew had been planning this surprise for weeks, coordinating with Sarah, Pete, and the regular customers to make it special. "You didn't have to do all this," Harold said, his eyes twinkling as he adjusted his Navy cap. But everyone could see how touched he was by the gesture. The celebration wasn't just for Harold's birthday. Snake had an announcement to make. Standing up in front of the crowded diner, he cleared his throat nervously. "Master Chief, Harold. This past year has changed all our lives," Snake began, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "After learning about my grandfather's legacy and your teachings, we've made a decision. Our motorcycle club is being reformed into something new, the Frobman's Legacy Veterans Support Group." Harold sat straighter in his booth as Snake continued. The young man was wearing a new leather vest, and on the back was an emblem combining the Navy SEAL trident with a motorcycle wheel. "We're going to help veterans in need," Snake explained. "Everything from home repairs to hospital visits. We've already got 20 new members, including Tom and some other local vets, and we want you to be our honorary president." The diner erupted in applause. Mary from the flower shop wiped tears from her eyes, while Pete beamed proudly from behind the counter. Jimmy, now clean-shaven and wearing a collared shirt under his leather jacket, handed Harold a membership vest of his own. But Snake wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, gesturing to Pete. "We've been working with the diner to start a monthly veterans breakfast. Free meals for any vet who needs one, and a chance for them to connect with others who understand what they've been through." Harold looked around at the faces in the diner, the bikers who had become protectors, the veterans who had found a new community, and the regular customers who had witnessed this remarkable transformation. His eyes lingered on the wall where Pete had created a wall of honor, featuring photos of local veterans, including a prominent spot for the picture of young Harold with Snake's grandfather. "You know," Harold said, standing slowly to address the crowd, "when I was training young men like Snake's grandfather, I always told them that their greatest mission would come after their service, being leaders in their communities, setting examples for others to follow." He paused, looking at each of the bikers in turn. "What you boys have done here, turning your lives around and choosing to help others, that's the kind of victory that means more than any battle I ever fought in." Sarah brought out a special birthday cake, decorated with both the Navy SEAL emblem and a motorcycle. As everyone sang "Happy Birthday," Harold realized that his morning routine had given him something he never expected in his twilight years: a new purpose and a new family. The legacy he had helped create decades ago, training young men like Snake's grandfather, had come full circle. These bikers, once lost and angry, had found their way to a noble purpose, just as their predecessors had in the Navy SEALs. Pete's Diner was now more than just a place for breakfast. It had become a symbol of transformation, a place where past and present merged, where veterans found support, and where the community came together. The booth in the corner, once a source of conflict, was now known as the Master Chief's office, where Harold could often be found sharing wisdom with anyone who needed guidance. As Harold looked around at his birthday celebration, he smiled, knowing that long after he was gone, his legacy would live on through Snake and the others. They would continue to protect and serve, not through force or intimidation, but through kindness, respect, and understanding, the true marks of strength that he had spent a lifetime teaching. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting a warm glow over the gathering. In that light, you couldn't tell the difference between the bikers and the veterans, the young and the old. They were all just people who had learned one of life's most valuable lessons, that it's never too late to change, to make amends, and to become something better than you were before.